In the last couple of lectures, we've been talking about the problems the church had right on the eve of the Reformation period. Now we're going to talk about some of the responses or solutions offered to the church's problems. Of course, the most famous of those responses is Luther's Protestant Reformation, which we'll begin talking about in the next lecture. But before that, we have to take a look at one other reaction to the church's problems, which came from intellectuals in Northern Europe who were quite concerned with the difficulties the church was having. These intellectuals were called the Northern Humanists, sometimes called the Christian Humanists, but that's kind of a misnomer because even the Italian humanists were quite religious, so it's better to call these guys the Northern Humanists. The answers that they offer to the church's problems, though, come right out of the humanist tradition, and they in fact are very influenced by Italian humanism. And with the answers they offer and the solutions they propose, they pave the way for what Luther's going to come along and do a little bit later on. So we're going to take a look first at exactly what Northern humanism was, where it came from, some of its basic ideas about the church, and then we'll take a look at some specific Northern humanists and what they had to say about the church's problems. Well, humanism spread north from Italy after 1500 quite rapidly, and brought with it all the typical elements of humanism: the liberal arts education, the stress on rhetoric, love of the classics, particular view of history. But Northern humanists were especially interested in a revival and renewal of religious life because they were quite concerned about the problems the church was having. And their perspective was a typically humanist one. Just as the Italian humanists had rejected medieval learning in society in favor of classical culture, the Northern humanists rejected medieval religion and a medieval church in favor of a return to what they called the apostolic church, or the church of Christ and the apostles, the first church, the church as it was in the Roman Empire, antiquity, again, a humanist trend, because they believed the apostolic church to have been pure and uncorrupted by the Middle Ages, and a golden age in the history of the church, just like antiquity was a golden age of culture and prosperity. So the Northern humanists call on people to copy the apostolic church, and in doing that, to cleanse the church of their own day of all its problems, and to cleanse religion of its impurities. How are you going to copy the apostolic church? Here again, the answer is very typically humanistic. You go back and you read the classics. In this case, you read the classics of the early church. And those classics would be the writings of the church fathers, the very first important theologians of the church, such as Ambrose and Jerome and Augustine. But of course, the most important classic of the early church was the Bible. And so humanists stress reading the Bible a lot more than the official church did. The official church actually discouraged people from reading the Bible, believing that ordinary people could not interpret the Bible, whereas the church could correctly interpret it because the church had the Holy Spirit. However, the humanists believed that everyone should read the Bible and copy the ancient examples of the apostolic church. However, the humanists also realized that a new edition or translation of the Bible and new editions and translations of the church fathers were necessary, because knowing Latin like the humanists knew Latin, and having read these sources, they realized that there were many errors in copying and translation made during the Middle Ages. Now, during the Middle Ages, the way books were published was a monk in a monastery would take, the copy of the book over here on one side, paper on the other side, and simply copy it out by hand. And that's how he'd make, copy 2 of a book, and they make copy 3 by copying the whole thing out by hand. But this process of copying is extremely difficult. Oftentimes the monks would misspell words. Oftentimes they would leave out words. Sometimes they would skip whole lines just because of the way their vision was working. And even more interesting, sometimes they would actually add things to the text they thought should be there that weren't there in the original. And the humanists picked up on all this, and they said, we got to get new translations that'll be as close as possible to the original text that, say, Augustine wrote, and get rid of all these translation errors and additions and stuff, because that's just, pollutes the source. And of course, they had just the tool to do this. They could use the humanist science of philology, and they could make new translations and get back as close as possible to the original. Even the Bible. Lorenzo Valla, as we saw last time, claimed that the Vulgate edition of the Bible, the church's official edition, had translation errors and had to be retranslated, and that's something that Erasmus will later do. But even better than making new translations of the Bible would be to read the actual Bible in its original languages, which would be Hebrew for the Old Testament, Greek for the New Testament. And that's really what the humanists thought you should do. If you want to do the best job, you shouldn't even read a translation at all. You know, the Bible wasn't written originally in Latin, it's translated into Latin. You should read it in these original languages. So it became a task of the humanists, Northern humanists especially, to teach people how to read Greek and Hebrew so they could read the Bible in the original. Well, this led to a very interesting episode in Germany known as the Reuchlin controversy. Johannes Reuchlin was a professor in Germany who was in fact one of the leading scholars of Hebrew in all of Europe. He wanted to study the intellectual context out of which the Bible was born. And so what he did was he studied and taught his students to read Hebrew literature from around the time the Bible was written, to try to get a sense for, you know, what the intellectual milieu was like that the Bible emerged from. So he's really not telling them to read the Bible exactly, he's telling them to read Hebrew literature to get a sense of the intellectual context of the Bible. Reuchlin was attacked by a group of Dominican monks from Cologne who said that the study of Hebrew literature would lead people to atheism. And you know, this preposterous claim, first of all, shows the anti-Semitism that was prevalent in Germany at the time, and also rallied all the German humanists around Reuchlin and made Reuchlin into a kind of a symbolic hero of the whole movement. German humanists claimed that the Dominican attitude just showed how ignorant the monks were, how corrupt the church was, how much in need of change it was. You know, so it played right into the humanist hands, really. A German humanist named Ulrich von Hutten wrote a book or a work called the Letters of Obscure Men, which ridiculed the Cologne monks as ignorant and superstitious and, you know, not knowing anything. So Reuchlin really did get the German humanist movement off to a big start. In fact, humanism spread very fast in Germany. One of the reasons for the fast spread of humanism in Germany was that the printing press was invented in 1453, and all of a sudden books become much more readily available. Another cause was the fact that Germany had many big cities and many universities, which came to be centers of humanist learning. And finally, there was the fact that many Germans traveled to Italy and many Italians traveled to Germany. There was a lot of traffic back and forth, and so ideas traveled back and forth. The first center of humanism in Germany was at the University of Heidelberg in the southern part of Germany. And there, one of the earliest teachers of humanism was a man named Peter Luder, who was professor of Latin. And as professor of Latin, he was obviously exposed to many humanist ideas. The guy known as the father of German humanism, however, was Rudolf Agricola, also professor at Heidelberg. Born in the Netherlands, studied at various different universities, Erfurt, Cologne, Leuven, spent 10 years in Italy, 1469 to 1479, and during that time became a humanist and a follower of Petrarch. He brings Petrarch's ideas back to Heidelberg and becomes a major teacher of these ideas there. One of his students was a man named Conrad Celtis, student at Heidelberg. He was trained as a classical Latin poet, so he wrote poetry in classical Latin. And he also was quite interested in religious reform, as we'll see many of these humanists were. But he was also interested in another thing. He said, now, we as humanists, we want to read the classics. But you know, we're also Germans. And if shouldn't we try to read some German classics? So what was going on in Germany during the period that the classics were being written in Rome, for example? And can we go back and discover German classics to read? Well, of course, during the Roman Empire, Germany was controlled by the various barbarian tribes, and literature was pretty much an unknown phenomenon. But Celtus did find a German classic. He found a book called the Germania, or the Germany, written by the Roman historian Tacitus. And it played up the simple virtues of the German barbarian tribes, their honesty and their courage and their determination and their simplicity, and Tacitus did this to contrast it with the corruption and luxury of the late Roman Empire and Roman emperors. So it was the whole book was made to look, was intended to make Germany and the German ancient period look good, and so Celtus thought that was terrific. And he became a major teacher of Tacitus all through Germany. Traveled from city to city, giving lectures on the Germania, and leaving behind groups of humanist students that he instructed, which he called sodalities, or little kind of clubs of readers and students. Final humanist in Germany worth mentioning is Mutian, whose full name was Conrad Mutianus Rufus. He was particularly interested in religious reform. And he believed that one of the ways that religion could be reformed would be by stressing ethics over theology, basing religion more on ethical ideals and what it was to lead a good life, and kind of forgetting theology, because he argued that theology simply wasn't that important in becoming a good Christian. It wasn't something that most people could really understand. It wasn't something that people really needed to be good people and good Christians, and so we really shouldn't include that too much in religion. So in this case, Mutian was very much like Petrarch. He was concerned with how to live a good life, in this case how to live a good Christian life, very concerned with ethics. He called for a reform of the church based on reading the Bible and copying the example of the apostolic church, but Mutian actually focused in a little bit more than just that. He said, when we read the Bible, there are some parts of the Bible that are actually more important for learning these things than other parts of the Bible. And the most important parts of the Bible are going to be those written by St. Paul. Now, that's pretty much all Mutian had to say about this topic, but this is the first that we hear of something that becomes a pretty important tradition throughout humanism, northern humanism, and on into Luther's Reformation. And that is the stress on the Pauline sections of the Bible and what Paul had to say about various issues, especially salvation. And we'll see a little bit more of that in a couple of minutes, and we'll see later on that Paul and Paul's books in the Bible were of central importance to Martin Luther, and actually kind of brought about Luther's conversion to his ideas concerning salvation by faith alone. Now, I should just say at this point that most of all of Paul's writings in the Bible don't really directly suggest ideas that Luther later took from them, but Luther interpreted them in such a way that he got really a revolutionary new theological insight out of Paul's books. And you might say, well, now, anybody can read the Bible and interpret it in their own special way and get their own special ideas, and so what's so big about Luther? The interesting thing here is that people before Luther are pointing to the Pauline books, and they're even getting interpretations of these books very similar to what later Luther will do, and you'll see that in just a second. Okay, we move next to France and take a look at French humanism. France was another major center for humanist thought. There, it started at the very top of society. The famous new monarch of France, Francis I, was extremely interested in humanism. He wasn't particularly a scholar himself, but he patronized scholars. And he patronized Renaissance art.